Hello and welcome to FAST 2020 Federal Acquisition Service Training Conference, Advancing Acquisition. My name is Ellery Taylor, and I am accompanied by Mr. Hassan Harris, and we would like to present to you Procurement at the Speed of Technology. Briefly, in our agenda, what we would like to cover is the importance for speed in the technology of acquisitions and acquisition projects. We'd also like to discuss the typical contracting and acquisition procedures, as well as the typical technology stages in the development process. Covered will also be the Waterfall and Agile technologies, as well as the traditional procurement and innovative acquisition processes. We'd like to finalize our presentation with covering some of the modern technology applications that are really capturing the breadth of our acquisition in the government space, as well as covering innovative contracting practices and innovative procurement vehicles, strategies, as well as examples. I'd like to first begin with talking about how important it is to have speed in the technology of acquisition. And I think most of you, if you're familiar with a lot of our large IT acquisition processes, you're probably familiar with a lot of the struggles that a lot of our agencies experience in large, complicated acquisitions that take very, very long months, and in some cases, actually take years. And oftentimes, even after the acquisition is finished and the contract is awarded, unfortunately, the acquisition results in some type of a protest situation. Here, it's really, really important that we actually involve speed in these technology acquisitions. Unfortunately, many technology projects are outdated because of the methods and the strategies that are employed in these procurements. Many government procurements use long and cumbersome processes, which actually add to the complexity of the procurement. And at the end of this long, complicated procurement process, a slow development and implementation actually results even after the award. And then that, unfortunately, results in obsolete deliverables that are oftentimes outdated by the pace of the technology that they're trying to solve. And here's where we would like to kind of emphasize our most important point. And this point is that true speed can only occur when you have a convergence of acquisition innovation, as well as modern technology and development practices. And you have the both of them occurring together. What I'd like to talk about first is to kind of briefly cover, what most of us typically consider your average typical procurement process. And you can basically see that your typical acquisition, it starts out with development of a draft statement of work, an acquisition strategy, acquisition plans. You've got a series of very large, very complicated, and very detailed documents. And unfortunately, a lot of these processes and documents occur in a very serial process. And unfortunately, you step from one step to another, block by block. And you can basically see that I've basically identified roughly about 20 of the major activities that are involved in an acquisition. However, for large technology procurements involving contracting and budgeting and programmatic phases, we could often see, and I'm basically covering 20, but we could basically multiply this by 10 in terms of identifying the types of activities that occur in many of our large acquisition program offices. And you can basically see that by the time we've stepped through all of these steps, we've got the draft solicitation, we actually release it in the pre-solicitation review. The industry participants have an opportunity to respond. We actually release the solicitation, receive the quotes, we conduct the evaluations, we try to move towards negotiations, contract award, and then finally get to the award of the contract, the first and supplemental protests. In many of your large IT acquisitions, you can actually be months to years behind your pre-conceived schedule. What we really need to do is to move beyond your typical large, complex procurements, and you basically have to improve those technology development stages. And here, you're basically talking about improving the actual design even after the contract is awarded. And you have a combination of the actual procurement practices as well as the technology steps that are required in coming up with your various solutions. And here it's important that you step through very, very quickly the requirements, the design, the implementation, the verification of the solution, and then move into maintaining that solution. The traditional procurement methods and the traditional procurement processes are not properly suited for a lot of your modern acquisition innovative steps. And for most of your traditional, very conservative acquisition offices, you have very, very traditional, slower, more difficult, more complex, and however, in some aspects, what most people would consider a safer procurement because it follows more of the traditional rules and policies and procedures. The innovative acquisition processes, on the other hand, are speedier. They're easier to do. They're simpler. However, because they're not practiced on an ongoing basis, sometimes they might involve more risk because the folks that are actually doing these innovative practices are not as familiar with them and they're not as practiced as commonly in the acquisition community. When you look at the innovative procurement practices and you match them to some of your traditional technology development stages, you can actually see how things like your Waterfall and your versus your Agile technology methodologies can together actually save you almost double the time that you would spend on a traditional acquisition procurement. The waterfall cycle, and a lot of you have been familiarized with the waterfall in some of your traditional software development applications, where you basically go on some of your larger, more complex software developments that occur in stages. And here it's a serial process where you start at the conception, initiation, analysis, design, coding, testing, and then deployment of those software solutions. And it's a long, cumbersome process when compared to what a lot of modern technology development offices are doing with a lot of the agile methodologies. And here, with an agile methodology, the first thing that you notice, number one, is that it is not a serial process. You notice that from left going to right, you're actually involved in creating the conception, the initiation, the analysis, the design and the construction, the testing and deployment are all occurring concurrently. You have a concurrent process where a lot of the software coding and testing, analysis, design, and deployment is all occurring at the same time. And it's more of a revolutionary concept for some offices that are more accustomed to some of your long traditional processes. To give you an idea of the waterfall comparison to the agile methodologies, you're basically looking at replacing a solution where the user actually is not coming up with a minimal viable product. And they're in fact trying to do in the waterfall process, they're trying to step through the entire phases of the acquisition process from front to end. They're trying to cover all of the requirements and all the detailed processes required to come with a technical solution. And unfortunately, this stepwise process can take quite a long time to step through all of the stages required to identify in excruciating detail all of the requirements that actually build up the entire total solution. And when you compare that to the agile methodology, what you're basically doing is that you're starting small and you are accepting a minimal viable product. And you're taking that minimal viable product, and oftentimes it's a very, very small solution, and you're trying to achieve a very quick and stable result. And then once you achieve that result, you're actually expanding it using best practices, working to optimize the solutions, and building and fitting that solution and scaling it to fit the solution that you would like to meet within the organization. And the agile methodology is just one of those revolutionary concepts for many offices that have actually resulted in saving tons of time and energy in a program office and has enabled them to step from the very beginnings of the requirements process all the way to a solution in a very, very quick and timely manner. We often say with a lot of the modern methodologies is that you fail fast and you fail often. And oftentimes this doesn't make sense to the person that wants to start out with using the traditional model and step through detailed requirements, oftentimes building very, very large statements of work, identifying in excruciating detail all of the requirements involving all of the stakeholders of the organization. The fail fast, fail often is a software development cycle where you basically see that it's a circular process where you're basically stepping through the planning, the analysis, the design, implementation, testing, and maintenance of coming up with that solution. And you're basically going through that stepwise process, oftentimes several times before you arrive at a final solution for your agency. The modern technology methodologies also involve another concept called human-centered design. And human-centered design is also a stepwise process. However, it's not a stepwise process similar to some of your traditional models, like your waterfall methodologies. Here, we're basically talking about a stepwise process where we actually dive in deep to the human-centered factors that are involved in coming up with various different technical solutions. And here, we're focused on the user, sitting down with the user and looking at the skills that are required to identify the need. We define their needs and we use disciplinary curriculum where we actually dig down deep and use various different skills and methods that we ideate. And this is where we come up with ideas where we're actually prioritizing the needs of the user, and we look at them from many different aspects in order to really dig down deep and to really find out what the user needs. And once we arrive at that solution, we actually go through a prototyping where we actually build a top level design or an ideation of what we feel will satisfy that end user need. And then we test in order to ensure that we've made it. What you haven't seen is that based upon the testing, if we find that we have to go back, this process is iterative, and we can actually go back and go look at how we define some of those requirements, look at some of the areas where we try to ideate some of the solutions, and then tweak the prototype again. And then once that prototype is honed and refined, then take it back to that testing to be ensured that we actually have met the requirements of the user. The human-centered design methodology is a very, very powerful process that is used in the requirements process in order to ensure that in this long, complicated technology design process, that we really have honed in on our users' needs. When we come through with a lot of the methodologies that are commonly used in our modern processes, we often talk about several different types of end products that are the results of these innovative contracting practices and technology methodologies. Oftentimes, we talk about a pilot. And a pilot is a small scale model, and we basically use it to examine the feasibility, the duration, and the cost. We look at things like what types of adverse events that could occur, as well as what could actually end up with a full scale viable product. The prototype is something else that we come up with, and the prototype is an early sample or a model of the concept or the process that we would like to employ. The other item that is a result of a lot of our modern technology processes are modular or phased events. And here, instead of trying to take a very large and complex procurement process, as well as the technology development, we take the technology development and we break it up into phases. The acquisition processes are broken up into phases, okay? So here, you basically have a program office that is stepping through a phased incremental process of building a very large and complex system. However, the acquisition and the technology development are broken up into small, viable products. And this is a way that is done in a lot of your very, very successful innovative acquisition processes. And here you have, with the modular phase procurements, you have the acquisition process mirroring the actual technology development. In your typical acquisition organization, you basically have a myriad number of stakeholders. You have program and administrative organizations, as well as the procurement organization and the budget office. And all of these offices work together and step through these very, very long and oftentimes complicated procurement solutions. And if you look at an acquisition, this is basically your typical acquisition from front to end, where you're basically identifying the need, you're coming up with the acquisition approach, doing the timelines where you're examining the scope, budgeting for the funding, stepping through the procurement, releasing the award, conducting the evaluation, and actually awarding the contract. You're looking at a very long and oftentimes very, very complicated process. And it involves all of these different stakeholders. And each stakeholder has their own individual process that they try to integrate with one another in order to come up with that common solution. And oftentimes, if we follow this stepwise serial process, we will find ourselves in very long, very complex acquisition processes that take an inordinate amount of time. Here's steps in the innovative acquisition practices and methodologies to basically save the day. Because here, with a lot of your innovative acquisition practices and methodologies, you can kind of overcome a lot of the obstacles that are experienced by some of your typical strategic acquisitions. And here I'm just going to mention a few of the innovative acquisition practices and methods and briefly cover them. The challenge-based acquisition is where you take the acquisition and then you release it to the public. And instead of you defining in the excruciating detail and stepping through the acquisition, you basically present a public challenge. And oftentimes, this is often for a prototype or a small pilot of your solution. And oftentimes, it's for a smaller dollar amount and a smaller time period involved instead of stepping through some type of a monster acquisition. And a lot of your challenge-based acquisitions involve the public, and the public is allowed to leverage all of their innovation and ideas, and you really be surprised with the types of solutions that come out of your challenge-based acquisitions. We briefly talked about modular procurements, and we often talked about how a long, complicated procurement can actually be broken up into several different, we'll basically call them chunks. And you're basically talking about taking a very, very long serial process and breaking it up into very small procurements. And oftentimes these procurements are staged and they're dependent upon one another. So you basically break up, instead of having one large procurement, you have 5 very small procurements. Each procurement produces a deliverable that's then placed into the next stage of the modular procurement process. And you arrive at the final product after 5 stage procurement processes. And this is something that often comes up with a very novel solution, because what happens is the modular procurement doesn't identify the end product. Instead, the solution is derived through each of the stages of the acquisition and the modular requirements development prototyping process. Your phased acquisitions follow the same type of format, and here you're basically having several different phases of an acquisition process, and you're focusing in on the early phases of the acquisition and using those early phases to actually influence and shape and mold the later phases of your acquisition process. The comparative down select process is a methodology that's employed where you have a very, very large set of solutions or providers, and you use a methodology to down select to a smaller, more viable, and easier process where you, at the end of the comparative down select, instead of looking at making an award from 20 to 30 different offerers, you take the solution down to a manageable number, and whether that number is 4 or 5 or 3, you basically take a large complex acquisition and you actually take it down to a smaller number, where that smaller number is easier managed and easier developed, and leads you to a better solution and a better contract award. Shared services acquisitions is another methodology that's often employed in a lot of your innovative acquisition processes. And the shared services actually involve many, many different types of solutions, and you're basically providing them all together as a shared service, and you're satisfying, and oftentimes larger types of acquisitions, and you're satisfying the needs of a larger organization by sharing a lot of those requirements. And you're basically making advantages where you're taking advantage of economies of scale. Shared services are often very, very innovative in terms of solving the acquisition solutions for an entire organization. And I've heard stories of how, one organization didn't realize how, they were basically involved in medical processes. Well, in each of those medical laboratories and offices were all buying their own protective devices, rubber gloves, face mask, and so forth. But until they actually provided a shared service type setting, strategic sourcing first, and then shared services later, they were actually able to accommodate a much larger and more affordable and more economical acquisition solution. And fortunately, they were able to provide this to the entire organization. Human-centered design practices are also another methodology that are employed. And we actually talked about how human-centered design is a great practice early in our presentation. Concept development, as well as pilots and proofs of concept, are also very, very innovative acquisition practices and methodologies that can be employed in a modern acquisition environment. When you look at how requirements are taken in the technical standpoint, when you consider your traditional program office that would like to develop detailed requirements, when you look at that long and cumbersome process of developing a statement of work and you replace it with development of something called a statement of objectives, and here a statement of objectives is a very short, oftentimes 1 and possibly 2-page document that would replace a document that could take 30, 40, and sometimes 50 pages long, describing in detail a requirement. You actually allow industry to come out with oftentimes what many folks would consider a better solution than if you had taken that solution and tried to tackle it by going into excruciating detail and identifying that requirement with the traditional model of a statement of work or a requirements document. The other area is in performance-based contracts. And performance-based contracts is another methodology that we can employ in order to take the requirements of a solution And this is and oftentimes applied to technology as well as service requirements, where you allow the user to actually come up with performance-based objectives. And oftentimes the evaluation and grading of these performance metrics are often left to the contractor to basically do what we call self-monitoring. And this is a just a tremendous way of taking the requirements of a complex solution and actually putting it in the hands of the contracting community, allowing them to define how they would satisfy the solution, and then allowing them to step through how they would track and monitor and establish those various different performance metrics that are required in order to analyze the adequate performance of the contract. Performance-based contracts are definitely a winner in this area. Consumption-based models for cloud solutions are often something that, instead of stepping through some of what many would consider your traditional obligation and award at a fixed price amount, and this is oftentimes something that stands in the way of a lot of cloud type acquisitions when the program office or the contracting office mandates that in order to award the contract, that a fixed dollar amount has to be awarded and obligated, and that fixed amounts have to be invoiced and billed according to your more traditional model. Your consumption-based models for cloud acquisitions and procurements allow for what basically occurs in a lot of your modern technology applications, where you're not really sure of the actual obligation amount because you're basically consuming a model that's based upon a cloud type acquisition. Staged contracts are another way that we can actually step through the requirements needed to come up with a final solution. And those staged contracts actually break those requirements up and allow you to analyze all of the various different aspects of the final requirement. Monthly deliverables are also used as an innovative strategy in that you can actually break up that requirement. And oftentimes, instead of coming up with one huge deliverable that's delivered after a 12-month effort, you can break up that deliverable into monthly increments and actually invoice and bill and pay the contractor, and this is often done on very large procurements, where you basically track and monitor their progress and you pay them based upon monthly deliverables that are provided to the government in various different stages. There are lots of innovative techniques and methods, such as oral presentations, and many of you have actually done this. And this is a common practice where you basically bring in the contractor and allow them to present the solution. And oftentimes you can move a very large, complex procurement through to award, oftentimes within a week time frame. And here you basically allow each offerer to present their solution in a timed and methodology where it's a formal, structured methodology for the presentation. Product or technical demonstrations are another method that are employed. And here you actually have the offerer show instead of tell. And when you show versus telling, you actually arrive at the solution and you actually demonstrate that the offerer can actually provide the solution to the government in a simpler and easier manner. Confidence ratings are also employed, and this is an innovative technique and method. And confidence ratings actually indicate how well we are satisfied with the offerer's solution and how well we think that the solution will actually satisfy the requirements of the government. And we don't go into the various details. And then oftentimes, to move beyond confidence ratings, you're going into long, drawn out, written evaluations that go into details that oftentimes aren't actually even necessary to adequately identify the offerer's technical solution. We've talked a little bit about down selects before, and down select is another one of those areas, as well as the comparative evaluation processes. Another is where you select the best suited out of an evaluation acquisition, and then you negotiate with those that actually provide the most detailed or the most favorable solutions to the government. And this select best suited and then negotiate is a great way to go from a very large set of offers to a smaller set of offers and save a significant time on an evaluation. On the spot consensus evaluations are another methodology that can actually be employed. And here, the acquisition process, instead of stepping through the long and complex step-by-step evaluation process, you quickly move to the consensus and evaluation process, which then allows you to move quicker to the actual award. Streamline evaluation and selection documentation is also another methodology where you're basically streamlining the actual acquisition process by looking at the evaluation and the selection of your solutions and then quickly moving to a finalized documentation of the technical and evaluation that allows you to go to award. Group and oral debriefings are also another methodology that can be employed in some of your very, very large, complex acquisitions. And here, the oral debriefings can actually step through a lot of the minutia that a lot of your large, complex procurements go through because they actually involve a lot less on the documentation side of an evaluation process. I've often talked about the down select as well as the comparative evaluation steps. And here I'm just going to just quickly cover the advantages of both of these processes. The down select, it does reduce the cost and burden to industry as well as to the government. It reduces the documentation, the review, and it actually walks the procurement through in a linear format where you can basically move through the trade-off decisions and reduce the number of debriefings and also reduce the number of protests. Many of you might be wondering, well, how do you eliminate or reduce the number of protests? Well, basically, the down select process is a process where you actually engage industry early. And if an offer does not stand a very strong solution that stands to really come in as a final winner of that acquisition process, the down select process actually encourages that solution provider a method in which they can actually save their time, save their resources, save the time and energy that they would have normally expended in stepping through months and months of a long procurement process. And basically, instead of of taking someone through a long procurement process where they don't really have a viable solution that would lead to an award, you basically allow them a way out where they can actually take their time and resources, energy, and focus in on another procurement where their procurement solutions and their technical capabilities might be better suited. The comparative evaluation process is ideal for task and delivery orders that fall under FAR Part 8.4 as well as FAR Part 16.5. It's not recommended for use under some of your larger procurements where you're involving FAR Part 15 procurements that involve many, many details, many pages of requirements and large complex statements of work. It's more suited to acquisitions where you're only going to look at a very small number of quotes and a very small number of evaluation factors and move very quickly towards award. And here you're keeping documentation to a minimum, and then you're not actually stepping through the long and complex process where you're doing very detailed ratings. And comparative evaluations is a great methodology for some of your smaller, simpler acquisitions where you're basically designing your acquisition to move quickly to an award. Some of your innovative procurement vehicles that you can actually use on some of these acquisitions, and the biggest one that comes to mind for me is the multiple award schedule. And here you have over 5,000 industry partners who are all offering a huge variety of commercial IT products and services that you can order from. You're talking services, you're talking products, a myriad number of solutions, socioeconomic categories that can also be can be satisfied with numerous contracting types and types of acquisitions. Your 8A Stars is a government-wide acquisition contract, and this provides you with access to a very high number of many qualified, certified 8A small disadvantaged businesses. The contract has a $15 billion program ceiling and a 5-year base period and 1 5-year option. The VETS 2 is another government-wide acquisition contract, and here this is set aside exclusively for service-disabled, veteran-owned small businesses. Alliant 2 and Alliant 2 small business government-wide acquisition contracts are also great technology contracts that allow you to cater your technology solutions through customized hardware, software, and service solutions. And you can actually come to a total package in enterprise type applications. What I'd like to do is to briefly just kind of close in talking about how the procurement methodology and the technology strategies employed together can actually make a crucial difference in your ability to acquire and deploy modern technologies. This requires an enterprise approach and a strategic focus. You basically focus on the problem areas within the organization, and you look at how you can employ different technologies such as cloud, employing artificial intelligence. Sometimes we might employ other emerging technologies like 5G, and you focus in on the technology strategies, emerging technologies, innovative acquisition processes to arrive at a total solution. You're identifying the maximum number of resources that can be employed to your organization, looking at having a common goal of pursuing that acquisition with innovation and the most readily available technology practices. This is where you literally take your procurement through to your time of award, where you're taking innovative technologies that would really satisfy a lot of those requirements that would have taken you months to years, and you're employing the most readily available technologies using the most innovative acquisition processes, stepping through the most quickest and most efficient technology strategies at coming by a solution. And here is that what we would call a convergence that allows your organization to have that innovative acquisition and technology adoption. I can't stress enough how it's so important to employ these various different methodologies together. And here, by employing these methodologies together, you're able to step through many of your traditional acquisition processes, and you're able to do things like challenge-based acquisitions, cloud-based services, services as an offering. You're enabling your modernization initiatives to actually accelerate through the acquisition processes, and you're innovating your practices within your agency, employing management and major acquisitions in a manner that's never been done before. In conclusion, true speed can only occur when you have this convergence of acquisition, innovation, and modern technology development practices all occurring at the same time. And I hope that I've explained in great enough detail how those different methodologies may be employed, how they're so much better than some of your traditional models, and also how a lot of our current contract vehicles can actually satisfy many of those developmental practices. I want to thank you and encourage you to utilize all of our GSA contracting processes in the solutions that you have for your agency mission needs. And thank you for your time.